welcome to our webinar number 9 of Diligence, which is entitled "How Gender Gaps Affect the Effectiveness, Adoption, and Impact of Sustainability Due Diligence Solutions." And as you can see, the date of today is the logo of Diligence, and we just have just 2 little minutes of delay. So my name is David Merchin. I'm a material science engineer, and I have worked 16 years in the battery industry. I will be today the moderator, and I've been for the last 7 months head of business intelligence at EIT Raw Materials, and I'm very happy to moderate this webinar. Before starting, I would like to thank my colleague Isadora Costa, Senior Project Officer for Responsible Sourcing at EIT Raw Materials, as well as Angelo Spork, the coordinator of Diligence Project at Vienna University, for putting together this agenda and supporting me during these presentations. Of course, I also express my gratitude, but we'll get back to that later, to the 4 speakers for their participation in this webinar today. This webinar is organized by EIT Raw Materials, which is the largest European innovation network in the raw material sectors. We are supported by European Institute of Innovation and Technologies. EIT Raw Materials bring more than 300 partners from industry, academia and research, and public authorities. And we do our best to have a key role in strengthening resilient and sustainable raw materials value chain in Europe. Let me continue the presentation by saying a few words about the Diligence project. Diligence is a 3-year EU-funded Horizon EU project aimed at strengthening human rights and environmental due diligence, HRADD. And we're trying to do that all across the mineral value chain. The project developed a one-stop platform, which is entitled the Mineral Trail, to help companies navigate regulatory requirements, enhance responsible sourcing practices, and improve transparency across the mineral sector. In the next slide, you will see some general information. So this webinar will be recorded. All the questions in the chat will be looked at, and we'll try to answer some of them at the end of the discussions. And we will send you the slides deck that will be shown a couple of days after the webinar, hopefully beginning of next week. So let's start with some context and some rationale about this webinar and why did we choose such a topic. According to the UN Trade and Development, women account for 10 to 13% of the global industrial mining workforce. A closer look at data from the Women and Mine of the Future reports shows similar trends across major mining countries. 10% of women in Brazil, in Peru as well, in Chile, 9 in Peru, 13 in South Africa, and 15% of women being part of the mining workforce, 15% in Australia. However, while existing processes and tools aim to support responsible business conduct, they often do not fully capture gender-specific risk or realities within supply chain and local communities. In our webinar today, we will look at how gender gaps affect responsible business practices and explore practical ways to create more resilient value chain. To get there, we are lucky to have a highly qualified panel with hand-on experience both on the mining industry and on gender-related issues. We will have first Sophie Rickard, a policy analyst at OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct. Then Ege Tekimbas, who is a lead for gender equality and social inclusion at AGF, which stands for the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metal, and Sustainable Development. Zenzi Awazi is the president of the Association of Women in Mining in Africa. And Madhuparna Datta is an expert with more than 25 years of experience in the semiconductor industry, but with a strong focus on gender-related issues. I will tell you more about each of these speakers a bit later. But let's start directly with Sophie Rickard from OECD, who will present the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Due Diligence Framework and detail why gender matters. Before giving the floor to Sophie, I would like to say that Sophie works on due diligence, regulation, and contributes regularly to the center's works on genders. Prior to joining OECD, Sophie worked on gender in a range of contexts, including as a consultant for the Women's Rights and Mining Group on their guide to gender and mining. Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm thrilled to be here with all of you today. And just checking you can all hear me well and everything. Great.
Yeah.
Well, yes, very happy to be here with you all. And before we dive into the mining context with our three other speakers, I wanted to just take a step back and broadly talk through what due diligence is and why gender matters in this context. So just to start with, I wanted to quickly recap the three main international instruments on responsible business conduct, as I am joining you from the Responsible Business Conduct Centre of the OECD. So we have the ILO Tripartite Declaration, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, and the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I'm sure many of you here are already familiar with those standards. Now, the OECD guidelines, which is what I work on predominantly, are the most comprehensive international standard on RBC, or responsible business conduct. And they're recommendations that are addressed from governments to businesses on our expectations for them to contribute to sustainable development, and address adverse impacts on people, planet, and society. And crucially, these guidelines incorporate an expectation of risk-based due diligence. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So complementing the guidelines for multinational enterprises is the due diligence guidance itself. Now, this was published in 2018, and it builds out the concept of due diligence through a 6-step framework with a detailed Q&A on how to apply this framework. Now, I know that we're here focusing on the minerals sector, so many of you will also be familiar with the OECD minerals guidance, which contains a 5-step framework. So that standard fits into this broader ecosystem of RBC standards that the OECD hosts. So now, turning to due diligence itself, we're talking about a process by which enterprises or companies identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address actual and potential adverse impacts. And this includes impacts that are gendered. And the process of due diligence is underscored by some key characteristics. So in particular, we want to emphasize that due diligence is a preventative process. It's about ideally addressing harms before they occur, and when we're not able to, then mitigating and remediating them. It involves multiple internal processes. It's a dynamic and ongoing process. It's not something you do once. And it's risk-based, so you engage with risks on the basis of severity and likelihood and prioritize them for action. And then crucially, it engages stakeholders. So on that point, we'll go on to the next slide. So a core characteristic, and I think something that I imagine many of the other panelists will come back to today, is that due diligence rests on meaningful stakeholder engagement. It's a really central characteristic, and it's emphasized throughout the standards. And in the context of the extractive sector, we actually have a dedicated guidance on meaningful stakeholder engagement, which I'll link to at the end. Now, when we talk about stakeholder engagement, we're really emphasizing an ongoing two-way process of good faith engagement throughout the due diligence process. So at the point of identifying risks, in terms of monitoring risks, in terms of designing remediation processes, stakeholder engagement features throughout all of this. Having briefly recapped what due diligence is, I think I want to emphasize now, why does gender matter in this context? So due diligence efforts, unfortunately, often treat gender risks or treat risks as if they're in fact gender neutral. So they potentially overlook how systemic inequalities might shape a woman or a man's exposure to risk and their experiences of the harm that results from that risk. Now, women represent just under 50% of the global workforce, and in some labor-intensive sectors or export-oriented sectors, such as garment and agriculture, up to 80 or 90%. Now, obviously, we're here today talking about the mining sector, and the statistics around this are different, and there are different characteristics between ASM and LSM, and I know other panelists will speak to this in a bit more detail, but this is just to emphasize that due diligence is relevant to women and relevant to men, and their exposure in different sectors varies. So understanding the gender dynamics of a sector is really important to understanding how to identify risks in that sector. Now, where women are present in different sectors, they're often concentrated in lower paid roles, often informal roles, and often precarious roles. And I think that's a trend that carries through into the mining sector as well. And they often have more limited access to representation and more limited access to remedy. Now, I know that my colleagues later will talk a bit more about the differences and the specificities of gender dynamics in the mining sector, but I think as a broad point, it's just important to emphasize that integrating a gender perspective across the due diligence process is key to actually enabling differential risks, differential exposure to risks, and then designing context-appropriate measures that address those risks and their root causes. And without understanding gender differences and exposure to risks in the workplace or in the surrounding community, it's harder to properly identify effective prevention and mitigation mechanisms. And before moving on, I think I'll just emphasize that when we talk about gender, we're talking about everyone. We're not always talking about women, but it is important to be open that a lot of gendered impacts are disproportionately experienced by women. And at the same time, I'd also like to emphasize that women are powerful actors in their own right. They're not just victims of risks, but there are a lot of scenarios where power dynamics might marginalize women, or where power differentials might leave women in this position of victimhood. So gender is something that's already foreseen in OECD instruments on responsible business conduct and indeed in other instruments on business and human rights. So if we look at the due diligence guidance, for instance, it highlights that due diligence should be adapted to the nature of the adverse impact on RBC issues. And this involves tailoring for specific risks and taking into account how they affect different groups, and that includes gender. So that's, as I said before in the previous slide, understanding the differential exposure to risks so that you can then identify, prevent, and mitigate those risks appropriately by adjusting actions based on a full understanding of the risk. Now, that's from the due diligence guidelines, and I'll just briefly highlight that gender is also mentioned in the garment and footwear sector guidance. We have it in our agricultural guidance. It's mentioned in the extractive sector stakeholder engagement guidance, and the OECD also put out a stakeholder statement with the Women's Rights and Mining Group that I think my colleagues will talk to a little bit more later. So this is something that's already foreseen in OECD documents. So if we look a little bit about the due diligence process itself and how gender might feature into this, I think firstly it's understanding how we understand gendered vulnerabilities in the first place. So gendered risks aren't uniform. They're going to look different across different sectors, across different geographies, and women's exposure and men's exposure to risks is going to be influenced by other factors, including race, including migration status, income, disability, indigeneity, sexuality, and a range of other factors that might shape how someone experiences the risks and how they're able to potentially access support to address a scenario. And because OECD standards around due diligence rely heavily on the concepts of likelihood and severity of an impact, these different vulnerabilities might enhance or increase somebody's likelihood of experiencing an impact, or the severity of that impact should it occur to them. And it changes how risks might be experienced and reported. So given this, one of the expectations the OECD standards set out is a requirement to scope and then assess risks. And if we take gender into account in this, it's about understanding, integrating gender into the assessment of risks and identifying different overlapping vulnerabilities, and in taking this through into an in-depth assessment and prioritization. One frequent issue we see with gender in relation to due diligence is that risks are often hidden or underreported, often due to fear or stigma, potentially due to power imbalances, and potentially due to fear of retaliation or a lack of trust in existing systems. They're also often missed by standard audit tools, and often grievance systems aren't designed in a way that's gender responsive. Now, the OECD expects that assessments be adapted to the nature of risks and be able to capture those risks. So in the context of gender, that would involve adapting assessments to ensure safe and accessible participation in combining a range of different methods, potentially quantitative or qualitative, to reach a full understanding of gendered risks. And then designing mechanisms that might account for other factors such as migration status or power imbalances. So if we move on to the next slide. Obviously, once risks have been properly identified, we move, well, ideally to preventing them, but where that's not possible, mitigating them. And this involves first understanding how gender and social norms affect exposure to risks. So that's taking us back to our previous point around overlapping vulnerabilities and around potentially hidden risks. It also involves understanding how commercial practices might contribute to a risk. So is the design of a company's operation, its purchasing practices, how it engages with suppliers, its sourcing models, are these contributing to risks and gendered risks at that? And also designing gender-responsive community engagement process and mechanisms. Now, a lot of the literature on responsible business conduct is often talking about issues in the workforce, but at the same time, and particularly important in the mining sector, is also the impacts on surrounding communities, and gender is an important feature in this as well. So off the back of that understanding, then tailoring prevention and mitigation methods to account for these gendered issues or gendered experiences. So that might involve adapting measures by, for instance, workplace design through changing facilities, through appropriate PPE equipment, through different infrastructure design. It might involve different kinds of training opportunities for women as well as men that are more accessible to them. And it might involve different modalities of community outreach that make it more easy for women or men or other stakeholders to participate in community decision making around a business project. Now, if we move to my final slide, or second to last slide, I'll briefly finish up by looking at due diligence in relation to suppliers. Now, the OECD standards expect companies to look at their own operations and across their supply chain. Now, obviously, that differs depending on the sector, and there are specificities to the mineral sector that my colleagues will talk to today. But I think it's worth reflecting that suppliers along the supply chain can often face resource constraints in implementing gender-responsive practices. And so that's something that's aware of for companies in the supply chain, buyers and brands to be aware of in how they work with their suppliers and the opportunities they might have through their engagement with suppliers and through their leverage to integrate gender responsive expectations into their commercial practices, whether that's through contracts and codes, whether that's through training that they do with business partners. There are different entry points through which companies can influence suppliers and influence other parts of the value chain to understand and adapt to gendered risks. So if I think we move on to my final slide now. Yes, I briefly just wanted to highlight some of the resources that you can see from the OECD that are relevant to what we've just discussed today. So I've highlighted there with the QR code, the due diligence guidance, which has quite a comprehensive annex talking about how to operationalize that framework. And then the minerals related standards on the environment, on the minerals guidance itself, and on meaningful stakeholder engagement in the extractive sector. And what I couldn't put on the screen today, but we will have on the screen by the next time I speak to you all, is our forthcoming Gender Due Diligence Essentials publication that should come out, I believe, in the second week of July, which talks through a lot of the points I raised in this presentation in a lot more detail and across various sectors, and hopefully of relevance to the mineral sector as well. So I'll leave that there and hand the floor back to David and my colleagues, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say and hoping to participate in questions at the end.
Yes, thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much. Looking forward for this gender due diligence document that the OECD is preparing, and thanks for having presented the six-step OECD framework. Let's now introduce our next speakers. Ege Tekimbas is the IGF lead for gender equality and social inclusion, where she supports government in integrating gender equality and social inclusion into mining governance through policy advice, practical guidance, and capacity building. With more than 20 years of experience in gender equality, women's empowerment, and social development, she has worked with organizations including UN Women, the World Bank, the European Union, and the Council of Europe. She has also contributed to leading publications on gender and mining governance, helping advance more inclusive and sustainable mining policies worldwide. Ege, today, I think you want to speak about the implementation challenges of such gender responsive due diligence that have been presented before. And also, with you, we will look on how to avoid some of the unintended consequences of such implementations, which make a link with what Sophie presented before of the hidden gender risk. There is kind of the follow-up on the same topic. Ege, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Maybe we can move to the next slide, and I can start us off. Well, I will continue from where Sophie left because she said something very important. If gender equality is not embedded throughout the due diligence progress, then we can exacerbate gender inequalities and structural inequalities. And today I wanted to focus on these particular issues because we tend to believe that when we have the due diligence progress in place, everything will be fine and will be contributing to better social outcomes, which is not necessarily always the case. So I think we need to make a distinction between what we say as due diligence versus gender responsive due diligence. And when we talk about gender responsive due diligence, it's also important to highlight that this is something particular because we are not only looking at gender risks, which is very important, and I'll be talking about gender risks, but these gender risks that we talk about are usually related to structural issues. They're related to structural norms, barriers, or similar social norms that are affecting women and their access to certain advantages. So when we talk about gender responsive due diligence, it's not only about mitigating risks, but it's also turning the table around and seeing how we can change things, how we can address the structural barriers so that we can create positive outcomes. So it's not only a risk mitigation, and I want to emphasize this throughout my presentation, and with the examples that I will give shortly, I think it will be clearer. We can move to the next slide. And I'll be focusing mostly on artisanal and small-scale mining. The reason for this is that not that LSM, large-scale mining sector, is free of gender inequality. On the contrary, there are many issues that we can talk about. But currently, the SG frameworks, investor requirements help us manage large-scale mining sector to a certain extent, and also to understand, see, detect risks and mitigate them. Whereas ASM, artisanal and small-scale mining sector, is more prone to risks being underreported. So I will try to focus more on ASM today, and I'll talk about some structural issues. And with this, maybe I can mention some of the issues that are related to due diligence. Some of them, and I will be citing some reports, because data, reports, research are so important for us to understand these issues in a complete sense. And I can also drop the links to the research that I'll be mentioning in the chat after the presentation. One important organization, actually two important organizations that have been doing important research about ASM and gender risks are ARM, Alliance for Responsible Mining, and World Bank. World Bank's 2023 report, Dell State of the Sector report, is exclusively on gender equality in ASM, and I recommend you to read that report if you haven't done it yet. It gives many examples, some of which I'll try to shed light today. One of the critical issues that the due diligence frameworks should tackle with in terms of ASM and gender equality is definitely debt, bondage, and labor used to pay debts in ASM. So this debt manipulation is a trap for women that we constantly see. And in these reports that I mentioned, you can see examples of it. And debt bondage is used to create a cycle of debt for women in ASM in the presence of cash scarcity and predatory lending practices. And I said something about structural barriers, and all the examples that I will give will link to structural barriers. When we talk about women and ASM, what we know is that women make a big part of the ASM workforce, 30 to 50% reports say. And whereas they have a very structural problem, which is access to land, access to finances, access to equipment. And given this financial challenges, that manipulation and other sort of forced labor become very prevalent in the ASM sector. So this is one area, that manipulation. And then the other area that we see, other problem that we see, is forced labor enforced by armed actors or coercive power holders in conflict-related areas. Again, I will refer to the ARMS report on this, and the report mentions that armed groups or abusive officials threaten and force people to dig, haul, or process ore. And whereas this may seem like a gender-neutral problem, it is not, because usually these tasks, because of the gender division of labor in ASM, crushing, solution, washing, panning, sieving, sorting, mercury amalgamation, etc., are usually done by women. So when coercion happens by armed forces or abusive officials, usually women are forced to work to do these tasks. So this is another type of gendered due diligence risk for us when ASM is happening in conflict affected areas. Another important aspect that we have to be careful about is trafficking and deceptive recruitment into mine sites. And Dell's State of the Sector report that I mentioned before reports that girls and women from many countries, including Bolivia, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, and Peru, have been trafficked to mining areas after being lured by promises of economic opportunity. So this is, again, a gendered risk that is happening throughout countries and throughout the ASM sector. One other risk related to the to due diligence is child early and forced marriage linked to ASM communities. And again, the report, Dell State of the Sector report, mentions that the ratio of child marriages is extremely high among women and girls compared to men in ASM communities. Especially, for example, a case study in Zimbabwe showed that these marriages are usually seen as a safety net by girls or their families, and girls are being forced and coerced to marriages, early marriages, where they are forced to work as in forms of domestic servitude. So this is another due diligence risk that is very particular to ASM. And also, we need to talk about sexual exploitation, forced sex, and coercive transactional sex around ASM sites. And it goes back to the structural barriers again. We mentioned that women has less access to financial resources. And this creates a very weak position for women in mineral supply chains, leaving them dependent on more powerful mine actors for their livelihoods. And research from DRC, for example, shows that women in ASM communities may engage in transactional sex, including with administrative agents to gain minerals licenses or with other actors who can provide them with equipment and access to mine sites. In some countries, for example, in Tanzania, this form of relationship takes the name of gold marriages. In Madagascar, you hear the term sapphire marriages. So it means that in access to land, in access to being able to get your livelihoods, you are forced to transactional sex, which is a very exploitive form of relationship in that context. Also, there is a GIZ research that had been done in collaboration with the women's rights and mining group Sophie mentioned. And in that research, there are some very important case studies from Uganda. In Uganda, we see that, for example, women were trading sexual favors to receive help from men for breaking hard rock when they couldn't access equipment to do the job. Also, the same report points something very important in the context of due diligence, because when we talk about due diligence in the mineral sector, one of the highlights is child labor. So it is like blanket no to child labor, which is, of course, great. Nobody wants child labor. But then we have to think about structural barriers once again. Many women do not have any place to leave their children with, so they have to bring their children to the mine sites for being able to work there. So you cannot deal with this problem by a blanket ban, as can be seen from the research that had been done by GIZ in African countries, sub-Saharan African countries. The data from Uganda show that for being able to bring their children to mine sites, women were trading sexual favors to officials for being able to access and bringing their child. So we are not necessarily solving the problem by creating the rules unless we address the structural issues that are creating these problems. Similar examples are found by another NGO in DRC. So this is not unique to Uganda, but this is happening in many, many different countries and contexts. Maybe with this, I can also say that some of these issues are also happening in large-scale mining, as I said before, usually in the forms of sex rotation. The report by GIZ that I mentioned before shows that around 42% of women interviewed in that project explained that expressed that they had been asked for sexual favors in return for jobs in large-scale mining. So this is not to say that these issues are particular to ASM, but as I said before, there are structures, there are ESG requirements, and there is more reporting mechanisms, more established reporting mechanisms in large-scale mining that can help us address these problems. But whereas in ASM, usually, and with this maybe we can move to the next slide, usually the problem becomes the way that we solve the problem is actually for many downstream buyers is not to source from ASM. So rather than trying to solve the problem, rather than creating mechanisms to address the structural issues that we have talked about, usually the response is not sourcing from ASM, which doesn't really help women at all. So because usually ASM is a livelihood for those women rather than only being a job. And I know that Zenzi will talk about this, but very briefly, I'll give you this example from another research in sub-Saharan Africa where they try to analyze economic opportunities linked to ASM for women and men. And they found out that ASM is around 200 to 300% more lucrative than other sectors for women. And whereas for men, it's only 60%. For women, ASM is an important livelihood. It's between having food on your table or not having the food on your table. So by not sourcing, because these issues create a risk for downstream buyers. These are big risks for refineries, middle stream buyers. They do not source from ASM, but this doesn't solve the problem of poverty, structural inequalities, etc. So we go back to the issue of gender responsive due diligence. How do we do a due diligence that doesn't only analyze the risks and cut the risks by not sourcing from those people, but try to change the norms, try to change the markets, try to change the mechanisms? So this is how we should apply the lens of gender equality when we talk about due diligence. As I said before, child labor is a perfect example of this. We do not want child labor, but preventing child labor is not necessarily creating the ban only, but also providing mechanisms where women can leave their kids with so that they can also work, but also can keep their children away from mine sites. And it's not a dream. I can say that there are many organizations now trying to turn the things around and trying to create systems and mechanisms that are more favorable. One of them is a textile company, Caring, for example. They created that project in Ghana where they work with women miners. They created mechanisms for them to deliver due diligence and also report due diligence compliance so that they could also enhance their market access. So these kind of approaches are speeding up, and we hope to tap into these good practices more. And with this, maybe my last slide will be, Sophie also mentioned this, but I'll try to drop the link in the chat. There is a stakeholder statement of Women's Rights and Mining Group and OECD. It's about gender responsive due diligence, and it enlists the actionable items for different stakeholders, including governments, industry, and civil society. And I'd invite you to read the statement. And if you are if you're an active player in the mineral supply chains, you may want to be a signatory to the statement. You can reach out to me and I'd be happy to connect you with the Women's Rights and Mining Group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ege, for this some of the frightening examples, but to see indeed the challenge of when due diligence are too complex, has to still face them to help ASM being a supply instead of just not considering them. Thanks for this real-world example for identifying the challenge of the gender responsive actions. Before, let me introduce Zenzi. Zenzi Awases, who is the president for the Association of Women in Mining in Africa, AWIMA, and as well the chairperson of the Women in Mining Association of Namibia. So with a background in geology and institutional leadership, Zenzi advocates gender equity and inclusive participation across Africa mining sector, supporting more sustainable and socially responsible mineral value chain. So let's go now again with Zenzi to other real-world examples from women in mining and artisanal and small-scale mining in Africa. Zenzi, the floor is yours.
David, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody on the call. So let me go straight into it. So the two speakers before me have told you what the frameworks expects. And so I'm going to go, as David said, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what's actually happening on the ground, especially from an African perspective, and why these two things are not yet the same. So I start my presentation off by asking the question, why do we mine? Why do people mine? And it's something that I always ask when we're having these discussions about mining industry and where we are currently. And the answer usually, the answer usually is we mine to sustain livelihoods. whether you are mining as a small scale operator or whether you're mining as a large scale operator, you at the end of the day, you're putting food on the table. And what the African women miners have done so far is that they've built something entirely out of it. They've added quality of knowledge that no consultant report could actually accurately capture. Now, we also know the statistics. Women make up about 40 to 50% of artisanal miners across Africa. And in that, and this is a historical thing, they have built knowledge of these value chains over generations through daily practice. And that knowledge is what global supply chains are always missing. Next slide, please. So I just want to draw the context why that we cannot ignore. Just a little bit of background to why we are here, why we're having this discussion. We all know that Africa has the minerals, so all the minerals required for the transitions, the energy transitions are lies in the belly of African women. And also, as much as the energy transition matters to us all, the urgency is currently, or for the past couple of years, have been driven from global north. While we here in Africa are still negotiating our own place in that future. And thirdly, partnership must mean partnership. Any framework governing the sector must be built with Africa's development need at its center, not as an afterthought. I just want to bring that into perspective. Next slide, please. So due diligence frameworks have been developed a while ago, right? Largely designed in the early 2010s, but there seems to be a visibility problem. The tools cannot see what is documented, and in ASM especially, most of what matters is actually hardly documented. Now, 60% of the ASM operators are unlicensed or are unaware of requirements, and women are disproportionately concentrated in that invisible majority. No data does not mean no risk. I have to emphasize that it means visibility. Now, I wanted to just park there for a second. Usually the tools were built, and I think both the previous speakers have mentioned that, Eka just mentioned that the tools were not always gender responsive. They were built to identify things such as conflict, armed groups, and revenue flow. So we did a recent field study in a major African copper and cobalt producing country, and of that, in that study, about 82% identified gender. We were focusing on ASM, and 82% of the sample that we were looking at identified gender discrimination as a barrier to women's participation. Eka mentioned it as a structural barrier, and this was actually mentioned straight up. The highest response rate of any question in the entire survey. Of the survey, 75% of the ASM operators had no awareness of international due diligence requirements, and the same requirements their buyers must comply with. Again, 29% were fully licensed, meaning 71% will operate outside of these formal systems, invisible to any due diligence process. I have to highlight, though, that these are preliminary findings. We will give a full report at the end of the study, towards the end of the year. But if you apply the principles of inferential statistics, you will see that the data is telling you something. On the next slide, I'm talking about what the data is actually telling us. So what the data is really telling is that this is not a knowledge gap, it's a design gap. It's not even telling us a representation problem. It's telling us that it's a supply chain intelligence failure. So when companies conduct due diligence and find nothing alarming, they are not finding an absence of risk. It's very important to know that they are finding an absence of data. Those are two very different things. Now, in the next slide, I talk about the three things that must change. Next slide, please. We keep on emphasizing this. Gender disaggregated data as a baseline is very, very important. It shouldn't be coming on as an add-on. It's a non-negotiable starting point for any due diligence tool operating in ASM context. Secondly, women must be seen as participants and not just as subjects. Community engagement methodologies must be redesigned so women have a seat at the table and not just appear in findings. And I must say this though, that the tools that are being currently developed are placing more and more emphasis on that, and we are updating that as it comes as it comes along. And thirdly, and also very importantly, the absence of data is a red flag and not clearance. In other words, the frameworks must include clear protocols for when information is missing or unverifiable. In ASM, there will be a norm and not an exception. So we have to find a middle ground somewhere. And the middle ground that I'm proposing is that any tool designed for Africa without Africa's developmental needs at its center will not generate justice, and it will not protect the planet, which is what we're trying to do. And the energy transition is a global project, so framework is governing it. So whether it is a due diligence framework or anything, it must therefore reflect the realities of everyone who makes it possible, including the women mining the minerals at Powered. Now, our women's position on this is the following. Please, the next slide. And I think this is my final slide. We are here to make it work for everyone, but it has to start from the ground up. It must be based in truth of what's actually happening on the ground. Our women miners are not waiting to be included. We are already doing the work. So any due diligence tool that comes from here, in fact, I almost want to say from here on forth, but I know with, for example, the project we were working on currently, myself and Isadora, the due diligence project, that we are looking at updating or looking at principles that can work, taking in consideration gender in exclusion, can I call it that? Because that's what it is, gender exclusion, and how to update that in all the other principles that have been written already. Not to dismiss what has been done, but just to include that and make it a very, very strong point. And I believe that's my last slide, Dave. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Zenzi, even to have continued despite the internet issues. Yes, indeed, it's not because there is no data that there is no fact, right? It's just that we are missing data, and I think the approach of the design gap is very interesting. I'm looking forward, for example, of data, but I think that these questions will come up in the chat after the last presentations. So let's conclude indeed with Madhu Parna. Madhu Parna is an expert with more than 25 years in the semiconductor industry across the UK, India, and Sweden. As the AE Director of Cadence Design System, she supports advanced chip and system IP design initiatives. So really in another field than the mining industry. But Madhu Parna is a global ambassador for the Society of Women Engineers and a strong advocate for STEM inclusion and semiconductor talent development. So let's see now to better understand how these challenges continue further downstream and to open up with a new sector such as the semiconductor and the high-tech sectors. Madhu Parna, we're very happy to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, David. I have to say, when Isadora first approached me about this, I was like, but I've got no clues about mining. What will I say on this forum? So I just want to say good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss quite a critical yet frequently overlooked dimension of the technology supply chains. So when we talk about sustainability due diligence, the conversation often centers around the macroeconomic metrics or generic labor compliance. But today we are probably going to pull back the curtain on the semiconductor industry, especially. We will look at how systemic gender gaps could directly compromise the effectiveness, adoption, and long-term impact of the very sustainability tools that we rely on. So as an engineering leader and a global ambassador for the Society of Women Engineers, I view this not just as a corporate responsibility issue, but as a core engineering and operational resilience challenge. So while my fellow panelists have well illuminated the vital and stark realities of upstream mineral mining, my goal today is to show you that the gender blindness of our current due diligence models also follows the silicon all the way into our cleanest labs and most advanced packaging facilities. So to understand the impact of gender gaps, we have to recognize that the semiconductor value chain operates in two distinct parallel realities. So on one side, we have got the R&D, design, and high-tech fabs. Here, the primary gender issue is a severe representation gap. So women occupy less than 20% of the high-tech engineering workforce. And this creates an invisible tool bias because the design frameworks, the software interfaces, and the hardware testing will default to the male physiological and cognitive baselines. So women face everyday ergonomic exclusions, everything from clean room apparel to your VR testing goggles, which are fundamentally misaligned with female safety standards. Conversely, if we look downstream at the OSAT, the outsourced semiconductor assembly and test side of it, the picture changes. Here, women are heavily represented, but predominantly in low-paid manual roles. On these assembly lines, they face high concentrations of toxic chemical processes that directly impact maternal and reproductive health. And further upstream in mineral sourcing, we have already heard from the panelists as to how they bear a disproportionate burden of modern slavery risks. So our due diligence frameworks have to be sophisticated enough to address both the realities simultaneously. Next slide, please. So why do standard compliance frameworks miss these dual realities? Well, because they're fundamentally gender blind. So let's break this down using our webinar's core theme. So first is the effectiveness part of it. So traditionally, sustainability assessments view the workplace processes as completely neutral. By ignoring the distinct gender roles, they fail to map specific labor abuses or systemic risks, rendering that entire data collection process quite ineffective. Second, if we look at the adoption part of it, think about the generic corporate whistleblowing hotlines. So if a female factory worker faces harassment or gender discrimination, a generic web form or standard hotline would fail to guarantee her physical safety, anonymity, cultural trust. And when people do not trust the channel, they don't use it, and it completely stalls the adoption of ethical reporting. Third, if you look at the impact part of it, right now our industry's, air quality, ergonomic loads, chemical exposure limits are calculated using some historical male standard reference bodies. And when you ignore the physical, sort of physiological realities of the female body, our health and safety metrics fail to make a real productive impact where it's most needed. The next slide, please. So if you look at it, how do we really go about fixing it? We must, of course, evolve our due diligence from a passive checklist into a gender responsive framework. We can achieve this through some three concrete architectural shifts. As we have heard from the other panelists, data is really needed for it. So we have to enforce mandatory collection of the sex disaggregated or gender disaggregated data, as we have discussed, across the supply as well as sourcing partners. Now, we cannot fix what we do not measure, and we need clear granularity when it comes to wages, exposure levels, and health incidents. The second part is, of course, the redesigning of the tools. And this is where our engineering community must step up. We need to embed some gender-specific standards directly into our CAD environments, the hardware ergonomic side of it, clean room gear, as well as the lab setups. And true sustainability means designing the environments that can safely accommodate 100% of the workforce, not just probably 60 to 70% of it. Secure channels. We must build trauma-informed, fully anonymous, culturally trusted reporting lines. These must be structurally insulated to protect vulnerable factory floor and field workers from corporate or localized backlash. Next one, please. So let's be completely pragmatic. Resolving these gaps is not merely an ethical, nice to have initiative. It's an operational and legal imperative. The global semiconductor industry is facing an acute talent shortage. We cannot solve that shortage while alienating or failing to retain half of the potential talent pool due to outdated gender-blind workplace practices. Furthermore, the regulatory landscape is also shifting beneath our feet under modern legislative frameworks, such as the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, that's the CSDDD. Companies are legally required to identify and mitigate human risks right down their entire value chain. So if our due diligence, is going to ignore the gender realities, it's actually going to be legally incomplete, and it could expose the organization to severe compliance and credibility risks. Next slide, please. So this is precisely where organizations like Society of Women Engineers play a really vital role. SWE works to systematically dismantle these barriers across the entire engineering life cycle. We provide the full life cycle support, active mentorship, and leadership tracks to ensure that women don't just enter tech, but they are able to thrive and lead. Concurrently, we also drive the systemic advocacy and building of connected global networks to reshape the corporate ecosystem into spaces that champion diversity, equity, and sustainable quality of life. So by partnering with professional bodies like SWE, the semiconductor sector can actively accelerate the pipeline shifts we so desperately need. And the next slide. So just to close out, sustainability cannot exist without equity. True resilience in our semiconductor supply chains requires us to look closer, gather more data, and intentionally design inclusive ecosystems from this EDA software level all the way to the assembly floor. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to our other sort of questions and the other parts of the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Madhuparna. When mentioning the STEM activities, I can only mention the Girls Go STEM initiative led by EIT Raw Materials, EIT, that goes in the same direction. Thank you very much for your presentation. It really allowed us to go from upstream framework to the downstream and even to open up to new field. Also, Madhuparna, I like very much the two the segmentation between the R&D centers and the outsourced semiconductors, where the challenges are indeed quite different. We don't have so much time for questions, but thanks. So I will just pick a couple that we have identified. So the question I will start with is this one, and maybe the four of you can answer. Which single change would most improve gender responsiveness? Is it better data, better consultations, better standards, or better support mechanism? Who wants to start on this question?
You know what I'm going to say? I'm going to say all of them.
Yeah.
I'm sure Sophie and others can correct me on this part.
Yeah, I
Sophie,
think sorry, Sophie, go ahead. But while I have the mic, can I just go for it? It would be data. That's for me is a no-brainer. There is not enough information about women involved in the sector at all. Number one. Number two, once you have the data, you still want to go in the field to verify some of the information that you have out there. This study that we're doing currently, and I'm not at liberty yet to give the country where we're doing the study in, but it shows that what is out there in terms of gender equality and everything that's been done in terms of women empowerment and what's actually on the ground are two very, very different stories. And so data is definitely something that is so important. Look, you mentioned data, and what was the other one? I forgot.
Sorry, I have a question on data. Sorry, Ege, but when you say data, is it only the amount of women, or what type of other data do you have in mind that you believe will be useful?
So in our WIMA, we have come to a point where we actually define the various types of women. You need to know when you're saying women in mining, are you talking about artisanal mining? Because they have their own challenges, which will have to be addressed in due diligence processes. Then you need to address large-scale mining. And what are the granularities between the two groups? What are the challenges faced of women in mining who are younger than, you know, the youth, for example? In fact, even when we say women in mining, what about the women entrepreneurs in mining? They also have different challenges. Now, so when we say women in mining, you throw a big blanket across all we have 5 different groups. You know, even the ones in community are women in mining. So how do you address that?
Indeed.
So more accurate
Thank
data.
you. Yeah, indeed. Let's listen to Sophie, who was, and then conclude with Ege. Sophie?
Thank you. Well, I guess for me, if I was to say one single change, it would just be action, essentially. And I hope what my presentation showed is that the notion of gender fits very easily into the due diligence framework. It's just that we have to bring that perspective in proactively. We have to take that action. And that will help us, I think, including on issues like the data that my colleague has pointed to so clearly. If we take that action through assessments, through prevention, through mitigation, that's what's going to drive the change.
Ege?
I think I'll also say data, and for the basic reasons like for that, I think we really need to change the due diligence systems that we have in place. And for being able to advocate for the change, being able to advocate for structural reforms, we need to present data. And when we talk about data, I'll agree with Zenzi. We need granular data. It's not like the aggregate number of women, men doing certain things, but it's understanding what is the division of labor, what are the different challenges, etc. So it's more data and research. And I would say that if I hadn't given you the examples from research that had been done by other many organizations, then maybe you wouldn't be able to conceptualize the certain challenges that I went through. So it's really important to put facts, figures, numbers, so that the realities can be understood clearly and we can develop policy actions accordingly. Thank you.
Yeah. Why not losing the real life example you've shared with us and the frightening ones who clearly makes this story much more tangible and important to tackle. Thanks a lot. That's it for the Q&A. I would like on the next slide to briefly present yes, the next webinar organized by the Diligence Consortium, the business strategy in times of global crisis, with the company Anglo-American, Levinsource, who is a partner of Diligence project and a member of the Copenhagen Business School. So despite having started with a 2-minute delay, we were able to catch the time. So thanks to all of you. And for these questions, for the discussion, for the data, and for the exchanges, we will send you, as said earlier, the proceedings. And I hope you enjoyed this webinar. Thanks again to all of you, and thanks to all the participants who were in important numbers today. And hopefully, this issue of gender equality and in due diligence can now be better understood by you, and more actions and data be collected and taken. Thanks to the 4 speakers, to the Diligence project, and looking forward exchanging with all of you again very soon.